What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas, coming to you from Buffalo, New York, bringing you another edition of the Thomas Take. Earlier today, I did part 1 and part 2 of the Thomas Take. Tonight, I'm doing part 3 of the Thomas Take. And I'm going to be talking about, of course, the notorious one, Conor McGregor. What is next for the UFC lightweight champ? Could he be fighting Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson, the winner of that fight? Could he be going up against someone else? Someone that has just signed on to return to the UFC. And that is longtime UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre. Is that the rabbit that will be coming out of the hat that the UFC is hiding right now? The rabbit is Conor versus GSP. Not Bisping versus GSP. Not Nick Diaz versus GSP 2. Not Anderson Silva versus GSP. Could it be Conor McGregor versus George St. Pierre? I really think that there's some legs to this. Putting on the fight with Conor and GSP is a likelihood because of the fact that Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson are fighting for the interim lightweight championship. Let me repeat that. The Conor versus GSP fight is likely due to the fact that Khabib and Tony are fighting for the interim title. In the case in which Conor McGregor would be fighting George St. Pierre, this would then put Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson up against each other for the real UFC lightweight belt. Putting Conor up against GSP would stagnate the 155-pound division, but not so much, with the fact that Khabib versus Tony would be for the actual eventual championship title, much like Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar was at UFC 200. Just a hypothesis on my part. But would GSP and Conor McGregor be the greatest, biggest fight in the history of the sport? The answer is an emphatic yes, yes, yes. Putting the biggest star of yesteryear versus the biggest star of today in the octagon, agreeing to fight at 170 pounds, the former weight class of George St. Pierre, and a weight class in which Conor has competed on and owns a win over Nate Diaz in the welterweight division in the 170-pound weight class. It is likely that this could be a taking the rabbit out of the hat situation that the UFC is just not willing to comment on, due to the fact that a huge buffer, the buffer between this fight, could be the fact that Conor is lobbying for a fight with Floyd Mayweather. The UFC and boxing could be joining forces to distract the fan from the prospects of Conor versus GSP. Now, this is a conspiracy theory. That is where the conspiracy comes into the equation. With boxing and the UFC agreeing to make Floyd and Conor a topic of conversation, so to speak, to become a buffer for GSP and Conor McGregor. I think I'm on to something. I think I could be on to something. Furthermore, George St. Pierre has stated recently that he would drop as low as 155 pounds to compete in the lightweight division. The only reason in which George St. Pierre, at age 35 years old, 36 in May, would look to fight in the lightweight division would only be to take on Conor McGregor. There'd be nobody else for him to take on that would provide him with a big fight. The only guy at that weight class would be Conor. Possibly Nate Diaz, but I don't see the Nate Diaz thing. Nick and GSP have a history. I don't see that happening. I think I'm on to something. GSP versus Bisping is the fight that I want, of course. That's the fight. But the UFC has a way of making a fan think of one fight and then jerking him in another direction, giving him a fight that they never expected to see. And this could be that case. This could be another case in which the UFC pulls a rabbit out of its hat at the end of 2017 and says, MSG, Conor versus George St. Pierre. Think of the amount of pay-per-views that fight would get. It'd be the biggest fight in the history of mixed martial arts, easily. It would be the biggest fight of 2017, easily. And it would be one of the biggest pay-per-views in combat sports history, easily. The Canadian champ versus the Ireland champ. Canada's favorite son versus Ireland's favorite son. The two biggest pay-per-view draws in the history of the sport, in the history of the UFC, going up against each other. It sells itself. There's no promotion needed. You have a sportsman like GSP. You have a trash talker like Conor McGregor. Opposites attract. Conor has said as much that he's the man now, where George St. Pierre says, I'm the man. I'm back. Conor McGregor could say, oh, no, you're not. We're fighting each other. GSP could say, I want what Conor took from me. The top of the bill. Put us up against each other. Let us duke it out. Let's find out who's better. Anderson Silva's long in the tooth. Anderson Silva barely just beat Derek Brunson, who's a middle-of-the-road middleweight. Not middle of the road, but not a top guy. We'll just say that. Barely gets by Derek Brunson. And we're supposed to believe that the Anderson Silva versus GSP fight would sell just as many pay-per-views as it would have if it had happened in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. No siree, that's not the case. Anderson Silva's not the fighter that he once was, and the last guy I'd want to see him fight would be George St. Pierre. For his legacy and for the legacy of GSP, a victory over Anderson Silva at this point in Anderson Silva's career would mean virtually nothing. So, Michael Bisping has got Yoel Romero on the docket. Say Yoel Romero throws his hands up in the air and decides to throw a hissy fit about GSP getting the fight. The UFC did already offer the fight to Michael Bisping with Yoel Romero's name on it. Bisping had knee surgery. That postponed that fight for the time being. So if they were to put GSP in that spot, then it would definitely not look good in the eyes of Yoel Romero. So to avoid that clusterfuck, to avoid that situation, putting Yoel Romero against Bisping, okay, good to go. Bisping's fighting Yoel Romero. In order to give Conor the one fight this year that he'll probably fight, if that, Dana says he's taken 10 months off, in order to give Conor that fight, that one big fight that will allow him to cash in on 2017, it would be one GSP on the other side of that card. Who would be in the red corner, who would be in the blue corner would be the only matter of negotiation. Other than that, it would be a barn burner of a fight. It would be a promotion's dream to have that fight at the end of the year in December of 2017 on the top of a card. It's a long time for GSP to not fight again, coming off this long of a layoff, so to speak. But knowing that we'd have the whole rest of the year to wait for the biggest fight in the history of the sport, Conor's training. Conor's working. He's not sitting on the couch. He's training in L.A. You know who else is training in L.A.? George St. Pierre. Training at Wildcard Boxing Gym with Freddie Roach. Be the perfect buffer to distract the UFC fans by putting together GSP versus Conor McGregor, by talking about, forcing every combat sports fan to talk about Mayweather versus McGregor when that is far from reality. Mayweather versus McGregor, the perfect buffer for what is reality, what could quite possibly be reality, with GSP and Conor McGregor taking each other on in the octagon at the close of 2017, possibly September. I think September, realistically, another option. Reality would say that this is a conspiracy theory. Obviously, this is a conspiracy theory, but I do think there's some legs to it. It's speculation, and speculation is fun. But the real world would say that Bisping and GSP will fight in September in Toronto at Air Canada Centre. GSP's homecoming gives him a chance to get another belt, adding another weight class title to his legacy, while Bisping gets the opportunity at a big money fight, which has eluded his entire career up until that very point, if that were to be signed, sealed, and delivered. That gives Bisping that type of fight. There's so many options within this fight. The one option that makes virtually no sense to me whatsoever is Nick Diaz versus GSP. We saw that a few years back. GSP got 12 takedowns, put Diaz on his butt time and time again, picked him apart on the feet. There were moments where Nick was able to land some nice shots, but he was virtually outclassed. 50-45 unanimous decision across 3 judges' scorecards. And GSP took the belt home once again. I don't feel the need to see that fight. I don't know what would be proven differently in that fight for Nick Diaz. I don't know how GSP could do any better in a rematch than he did in the first fight. The fight doesn't really make virtually any sense to me. Now, what you would anticipate as well would be Yoel Romero and Bisping. I think that could happen, but I think GSP could get in the way of that. The fight with Bisping and GSP sells itself. A world tour from the summer to, September. It sells itself. Do a tour in the UK, do a tour in Canada, do a tour in obviously Europe, all provinces in Europe, all provinces in Canada. You would have a big fight to promote. Similarly to Aldo and McGregor, 2 international stars, Bisping and GSP. And as an international fight, it would be one of the biggest, maybe the biggest of all time. But obviously, GSP and McGregor would trump that handily. That is my take on what could be next for Conor McGregor, what could be next for GSP, a storyline that has not really reached much attention lately. For whatever reason, it's fallen on deaf ears due to the fact that Mayweather and McGregor is being talked about. Let's talk about a real scenario that could very well happen. GSP is signed back with the UFC. Conor's taken 10 months off. Could that be a fight? Could this happen? GSP versus Conor McGregor. I know I'd pay to see it. I'm Ryan Thomas, and that was part 3 of the Thomas Take tonight, February 24th, 2017. Drive safe, everybody. Have a good Friday night.